Hello, hello, hello. Hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, I think the audio is working. Welcome back to day 15, the Dailies 2026. Let's jump right into it, shall we? Today we read Job 40 to 42. We concluded the book of Job, first book that we have completed this year. And God's shown up. He's shown up, and he in chapter 40 he finishes off, his first line of his resume, really. And Job responds, and it's so interesting to see Job's response was effectively 4 lines. He's given what nine speeches, and spoke super eloquently, spoke super strongly. But then when God came, he had 4 lines, of which it was just, I'm sorry. The thing that reminded me of was sometimes in our pain and in our anguish, that's all we can see. All we can see is what we're going through. All we can see is what's before us, what we're feeling in the moment. And it really struck me as, with that sort of narrow-mindedness, with those sort of short-sightedness, it can feel like the world's ending. You might relate to this more maybe when you were super young. When I was young, maybe not doing my homework and coming into school the next day, knowing I haven't got my homework, and thus anticipating, um, the punishment that's associated with that. Back then, that felt like that was everything that mattered. That was the end of the world as far as I was concerned. I didn't have my homework, and the trepidation was real. It wasn't. It wasn't. It was just as much the end of the world as it could be for me in my 9, 10-year-old brain, right? But as you grow older, your horizon expands, and you see more, and you realize that there's more to life. And now we're thinking about, by comparison, bigger things, kids' health and, you know, paying bills. And again, I think we will get to a point in our growth, in our maturity, ultimately when we're in heaven, where the horizon expands enough to mean even those things that even now seem important to me, to us, will seem trivial. I was also reminded of Job in his speaking earlier on was akin to, or reminded me of folks that, so in Ghana, right? I grew up in Ghana, and we had a concept of zebra crossings. They were on the road anyway, um, but there wasn't as much enforcing of them, and thus there wasn't as much drivers really caring. If you start crossing the zebra crossing, it's up to you to make sure you get to the other side, as opposed to the driver of the vehicle stopping. And indeed, we'd see drivers who, by way of, I guess, asserting their dominance on the road, would actually speed up when they're coming and they see you crossing on the zebra crossing. But coming to this country, and I mean, the law is much better enforced. Drivers tend to be much more considerate. Um, and you see people sometimes have a certain audacity when crossing the zebra crossing because they are entitled to it, right? The law says to um, to observe, to give way to the pedestrian who's on the zebra crossing. And so, they're now strolling on the crossing unbothered, by how fast or slow they're walking, how quickly or not the drivers need to get by because they are entitled. That's what that entitlement fails to remind them of. However, is should an accident actually happen, should a car choose to ignore the rules, the consequences are far graver for the individual than they are for the car. Like, entitlement aside, if you and a car collide, one of you is closer to the grave than the other. And so there's a difference between the entitlement and the reality. And what we see with Job's response in that at the start of chapter 41 um, is a recognition of the reality. God doesn't owe him an explanation. God doesn't owe him an apology. And I think it can be hard to accept that thought if we overestimate um, our powers, we overestimate our weight. You know, can can my book, you know, stand up and complain to me that my handwriting is bad, or that I choose to make notes on work in it? Why am I not writing masterpieces or annotating Shakespeare therein? It can't make that argument to me because it's a book and I'm a human being. And I think what we see with God's response to Job is the recognition that he is God. Job is but a man. God goes on, in chapter 40, um, 41, I think, with a second sort of reminder of who he is and what he's done. He points out Behemoth and Leviathan, who, by all indications of their descriptions, are incredibly strong, big beasts at the time. And ultimately, Job admits, he says a line in, I think, 42, where he just goes, he answers God when God asks the question, who is this that, speaks so much? Who is this that challenges me? And Job says, it is I. I was talking about things that I had no idea about. I was talking about things that were far too wonderful for me. I take everything back. This is Job. And at this point, he hasn't been relieved of his suffering, of his pain. He was still probably sick in the body, still undergoing everything that he was going through. But in the face of God, he says, I knew about you, but now I have seen you. I take everything back. And I think that's the point of Job. There's just the book, whether or not it happened or is just fable, parable. Um, I think the point of it is to remind us that we are but men, and He is God. You know, I mentioned this, I think, 2 days ago. So I was reading the book from the Remembrance of Time, which is part of the series the three body problem is part of. And when the aliens, um, spoiler alert, when the aliens exhibit such incredible power, such a gulf of advancement against the humans, the writer says this line, and it's like, if the aliens are to, the line I quote is, if I am to destroy you, what business is that of yours? And it's the idea that they are so much more powerful than men that if they have to decide to do anything, what's men's contribution to that decision ever going to be? If we are walking down the road and step on an ant, what business of it is that ant to be stepped on? And unfortunately, it goes the other way. If God chooses to do what he wants to do, who are you? And so Job himself took back everything that he said because he's helpless to argue with God. But ultimately, it ends well. God actually heals him, blesses him, gives him twice as much as what he had before, um, gives him more children. And it says he lives a good long life thereafter. The only other thing of note is God rebukes Eliphaz and Job's two friends and actually um, causes them to offer a sacrifice and beg Job for forgiveness. And Job prays and God relents against them. The one thing that stands out is God didn't rebuke Elihu, the last one that spoke, which I think is significant. And so I think in my next reading of Job, I'll be quite interested to lay out the argument of the friends in comparison to Elihu's argument, because they were rebuked for not speaking the truth about God, but Elihu was not. And I can't imagine that's by accident. So that was the story of Job. That was the book of Job. And tomorrow we'll be back in Genesis. Tomorrow's reading is Genesis 12 to 15. So if you are following along, please give that a read. And if you're here and if you've watched, thank you for doing so. Um, I hope this encourages you to pick up the Bible, to give it a read, to spend some time with God. Yeah. Thank you for joining us and have a good rest of the evening. Peace out.